And so, a new life began for me. I was soon able to forget the warehouse and the Murdstones in learning to please my aunt and to play games with Mr. Dick, who spent much of his time with me. But one day, my aunt suggested that I should go to boarding school in Canterbury. I was delighted as I was eager to continue my studies, and Canterbury was very near my aunt's home in Dover. So, the next day, my aunt and I went to Canterbury, where I admired the beautiful old buildings in the ancient city center. "Is it a large school, Aunt?" I asked politely. "I haven't decided which school you will go to yet," she replied. "First, we are going to ask my old friend Mr. Wakefield's advice about it. He lives and works in Canterbury, you see." Soon, we stopped in front of a very old house with a very clean front doorstep and fresh white curtains at the windows. A strange-looking person, dressed in black, with short red hair and very thin white face, came out to meet us. I thought he must be a servant. He was about 15, but looked much older. "Is Mr. Wakefield at home, Uriah Heep?" asked my aunt. "He is, madam," replied Uriah, smiling unpleasantly. He showed us into the sitting room, where I noticed two large paintings on the wall. One of a grey-haired gentleman, and the other of a lady with a sweet, gentle face. Just then, a gentleman entered the room, looking a little older than his picture. I soon discovered he was Mr. Wakefield, my aunt's lawyer. "Mr. Wakefield," said my aunt, "this is my nephew. I have adopted him and I want to send him to a good boarding school here in Canterbury. Can you help me find a school for him?" Mr. Wakefield thought for a moment. "There is a very good school I can recommend, Dr. Strong's, but the boy cannot board there, and it's too far to travel from Dover every day. However, he could live here if you liked in my house. There is plenty of room for him." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Wakefield. I'll pay you for his food, of course," said my aunt. "Come and meet Agnes, who takes care of everything and manages the house," said Mr. Wakefield. We all went upstairs to another sitting room, prettily furnished, where a girl of my own age was sitting. On her face, I saw immediately the beautiful, calm expression of the lady in the painting downstairs, and I knew she must be Mr. Wakefield's daughter, Agnes. When I saw the way Mr. Wakefield looked at Agnes and held her hand, I realized that she was the only thing that made life worth living for him. The lady in the painting was her mother, who had died some years before, and Agnes was now in complete charge of the house. She welcomed me warmly as a guest and showed me the comfortable bedroom I would sleep in. My aunt was very happy to leave me in the care of Mr. Wakefield and his daughter. "I must leave now, David," she told me. "Mr. Wakefield will take you to school tomorrow and make all the arrangements. I'm sure you'll work hard and do well." "Thank you, Aunt," I said, trying not to cry, "and give my love to Mr. Dick, and thank you again." When she had gone, I dried my tears and spent a pleasant evening with the Wakefields. We ate supper and talked in the pretty little sitting room. Agnes played the piano and tried to amuse her father, but he often looked serious and rather sad. During the evening, he drank a good deal of wine. I wondered why he seemed unhappy. The next day, I had my first experience of a well-organized school. It could not have been more different from Salem House. The headmaster, Dr. Strong, was a gentle, kind man who enjoyed teaching and never punished anybody. I soon made friends with the other boys, and as time went on, with the teachers too. But although I liked school very much, I was always happy to return to the Wakefields' quiet house every evening. There, Agnes used to help me with my studies and listen sympathetically to my problems, and her father always seemed pleased to see me. I often wrote to my aunt and Peggotty, and Mr. Dick came to visit me once a week. The strangest person in my life was Uriah Heep. Soon after I arrived in Canterbury, we had a conversation one evening. He was doing a lot of Mr. Wakefield's work, and was working late in his small office, just off the hall of the Wakefield's house. Come in, Master Copperfield," he cried when he saw me passing the door. I entered and found him reading a large dusty book and making careful notes in a notebook. "What are you studying, Uriah?" I asked politely. "I'm going to be a lawyer," he replied, rubbing his thin hands together and smiling his oily smile. "You are Mr. Wakefield's assistant, aren't you? Perhaps one day you'll be his partner," I said, trying to make conversation. "Oh no, Master Copperfield," cried Uriah, rolling his eyes upwards. "I could never rise so high. No, I am much too humble for that. But thank you, Master David, for thinking kindly of me. And may I say that if you ever have the time, and I am sure a young gentleman like you is much too busy to spare the time for a poor person like me, my mother and I would be glad to offer you a cup of tea at our humble home." "Of course, if I have time," I answered and left the room quickly. I didn't feel comfortable with him for some reason, but the following week he invited me to tea again, and I didn't want to appear rude, so I agreed. That evening, he and I walked to the small house where he lived with his mother. It was a warm day, and we were drinking our tea near the open door when a gentleman I recognized passed by. It was Mr. Micawber. He saw me sitting near the door and called out, "Copperfield, is it really you?" I was delighted to see him again, and Mrs. Heep invited him in for some tea. I had to introduce him to the Heeps, but I didn't think that Uriah would be a good influence on Mr. Micawber. However, I was interested to discover that the Micawbers were now living in Canterbury, as nothing had turned up in Devon. They seemed to be very short of money again, and surrounded by creditors as usual. I left the Heeps house as soon as possible, taking Mr. Micawber with me, as I didn't want him to tell Uriah all about my life and the warehouse in London. And so the years passed. I learned everything that Dr. Strong and his teachers could teach me, and at 17 came to the end of my school days. My aunt suggested that, before deciding what profession to choose, I should spend a month in London or traveling round the country. This would give me time to consider my next step. I agreed enthusiastically, and although I was sorry to say goodbye to my sweet friend Agnes and her father, I was looking forward to leading the life of an independent young gentleman. To be continued in Chapter 5.